So, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start out by thanking our present and future audience as we continue our discussion on the topic of philosophical critiques of marriage. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today, Professor Justin Mogilski, who has so kindly accepted to come and talk to us about his latest research on consensually non-monogamous romantic relationships. Justin Mogilski is assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie, and his research has focused on conflict resolution within consensually non-monogamous romantic relationships, how evolution has shaped moral decision-making, and individual differences in predatory intimate relationship behaviors. He leads an international team of sexuality and relationship researchers studying consensually non-monogamous relationship maintenance strategies in over 10 countries. And it's such a pleasure to have you here. Our session will last about an hour and a half, so feel free to send questions through the chat, and I will relay them to Professor Mogilski for a brief discussion at the end if we have enough time. So, Professor, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. As was mentioned, my name is Dr. Justin Mogilski. I'm assistant professor of psychology at the University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie. Today, I want to present to you a talk that covers some of my recent work on consensually non-monogamous relationships. And in time, I'm going to show how I define these more broadly as a type of multi-partnering. So looking at how people maintain multiple relationships simultaneously. And throughout, I'm going to present how we can use evolutionary theory, and in particular, how evolutionary psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists have used evolutionary theory to think about marriage, about monogamy. I'm going to apply that to how we might think about non-monogamy and some of the challenges that might arise when someone attempts to maintain more than one intimate relationship. So to give you a little bit of background about who I am, because of course that colors everything that someone does. I was raised in Pennsylvania, the United States. I received my master's from Bucknell University, where I worked with a social psychologist named Dr. T. Joel Wade, who was an evolutionary psychologist, one of my more formative advisors in my pursuit of academia. And I got my PhD from Oakland University, which has a rather impressive core of evolutionary researchers. My advisor was Dr. Lisa Welling, but I also worked with Todd Shackelford, Virgil Ziegler-Hill, who is a personality psychologist, and Dr. Jennifer Vonk, who is a comparative psychologist. Traditionally, what I've done is published on topics related to intimate relationships, romantic relationships. My earliest work was on mate poaching. That is when you attempt to form a relationship with someone who is currently mated with someone else, rather than attempting to be with someone who is single. I've looked at infidelity, people's reactions to infidelity, including jealousy, mate retention. I've studied cross-gender friendships. That is, how do men and women typically tend to form friendships, and what are some of the opportunities and struggles that come along with those friendships. I've also studied morphometric cues of partner attractiveness. So that is physical cues that underlie or signal to others various aspects of partner attractiveness and partner quality, things that you would look for in a potential mate, including face shape, symmetry, etc. For my PhD, I spearheaded using a type of multivariate statistical analysis to study human mate preferences called conjoint analysis. I have several published papers on that. And then in recent years, and really since, I've almost exclusively concentrated my work on consensual non-monogamy, which is, I will abbreviate in this presentation as CNM. I want to give some background as to why I chose to study relationships from this perspective. So I'm not making too many assumptions about who my audience is. I want to explain, well, why use evolutionary theory to study something like romance? What does evolutionary theory predict about human mating? Well, at the very basis of everything, it argues that we are sexually reproducing organisms that are each attempting to transmit genetic information from our current generation to the next generation, hoping that those genes will be represented hopefully forever. The idea here is, of course, that our DNA is a blueprint for how we end up developing in response to the environment that we encounter. And as a feature of sexual reproduction, you often see that it leads to and introduces sources of conflict. This is very often called sexual conflict, whereby, for example, men and women may have different reproductive optima given the gametes, the reproductive cells that they have. So individuals who have many motile gametes, such as sperm, tend to benefit from pursuing the ideal reproductive strategy of mating with, well, hopefully as many individuals as one can, so as to produce as many offspring as possible, whereas individuals who produce relatively larger immobile gametes, such as eggs, benefit from being a bit more selective about with whom they mate with, and ensuring that any offspring that are produced eventually will have investment from the partners that produced them. And this produces the value of studying romantic relationships in this way is that it allows us to pinpoint some of the potential issues that, for example, men and women will encounter. But broadly speaking, this extends beyond sex differences as well, such as identifying sex asymmetric reproductive threats. That is, the kinds of issues, the kinds of reproductive challenges that men versus women may have had to encounter or resolve throughout most of our ancestral history, including cuckoldry, that is, the unwitting investment that one might make into offspring that is genetically unrelated to you. Of course, that would be an evolutionary dead end if you invest in offspring that do not in fact have your genes in them, versus, which is a relatively greater threat for men, versus partner disinvestment, given that women on average have to invest a greater minimum obligatory amount of resources and time into offspring. The psychology that arises from the genes that we've inherited should hopefully attempt to counteract that threat of a disinvesting partner or losing investment from the individuals who's helped you to produce that offspring. So what we can do from just this very simple example here is start to make predictions about how patterns of human mating will unfold. So we can identify how patterns of human mating follow an adapted logic. I would say some of the, this is too much work to summarize for this presentation because I have a lot to get to. But for those who are interested in learning about this, there is a handbook called the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships that I co-edited with Todd Shackelford that will be coming out this February. And two chapters that I might recommend are those that summarize the main findings from this field in how courtship, that is how people mate and date, as well as how individuals compete for potential partners in these two chapters here by Caton and Krems. But for the purposes of this talk, I might highlight jealousy and mate retention. Jealousy is something that follows an adaptive logic. You experience jealousy when you are in a relationship that is highly valued, some relationship that you might want to maintain. And you might experience jealousy when you perceive that there is some threat to that relationship. Maybe there is someone else who would come along and potentially steal that partner away from you, or be a, I suppose in less aggressive language, perhaps be a better fit and be a greater, be more preferred by your partner, and therefore they may spend less time with you. So feeling jealousy might motivate you to retain that mate. And there is an entire literature looking at mate retention behavior. I've actually studied each of these things, both in monogamous relationships and in my studies that I've listed here, Mogilski et al. 2019 and 2017. I've studied these in consensually non-monogamous relationships as well. And we are observed that although jealousy and mate retention look a little bit different between monogamous and consensually non-monogamous relationships, they still exist in each. So people are still seemingly operating on some of this technology, this psychological technology that has cropped up and stuck with us through the course of human evolution. So the logic here is that this evolutionary logic can be traced to identify how and why humans navigate intimate relationships as they tend to do. And so if we turn the focus of using evolutionary theory to why monogamy exists, why do individuals pair up with one other individual, and very often exclusively with one other individual, we can start to use evolutionary theory to predict why that might be the case. It's actually quite odd because in most societies, we permit some type of multi-partnering. And that might include probably the most, common example of that would be plural marriage. Often, again, the most common type would be one man with several different women. It's accepted in most societies, and yet social monogamy, whereby one individual is with only one other individual, tends to be predominant in humans. There's a fairly large literature, not just in the evolutionary psychological literature, but outside in comparative psychology and bioanthropology, looking at how monogamy evolved and the benefits that monogamy may have conferred to help individuals overcome certain reproductive challenges that they would encounter again and again throughout human ancestry. One lead explanation is that given that humans produce highly dependent offspring, those infants might benefit from having long, enduring pair bonds between the father and the mother that produced those offspring that would help those offspring to survive. So perhaps fathers will stick around and help to invest in offspring, in part because that is both in the mother's genetic interest, but also the father's genetic interest as well. And other explanations extend this to protection from potential predators, from other individuals, other males who might come along and do something like commit infanticide or kill offspring that is not their own as they remate with the mother. There's an argument that competitive mate guarding may have led to monogamy, whereby men's best option may have been to stick around and, after having offspring with one partner, stick around and protect that partner and protect that offspring, because going off and fulfilling that ideal reproductive strategy of having multiple partners may have been too risky, may have actually, in fact, led to less reproductive advantage, especially given that children tend to be so dependent on caregivers. There's an argument that monogamy may be so predominant because it helped to suppress intrasexual competition, that is, competition between, and in particular, what these authors would argue, competition between men. So that is to the degree that monogamy assigns or allows men to form relationships with a woman, and that relationship is closed, then that prevents other men from coming along and competing with that male for that mate. And so having social monogamy might suppress that competition, suppress rivalry, and therefore suppress instances of crime, of violence between individuals who are competing for the same mate, and therefore effectively decrease the number of unmarried men. In this sense, monogamy might benefit really the stability of society overall. There are those who argue that monogamy, that is, restricting sexual behavior to just two individuals, might help to curtail pathogens or the spread of disease. And so to the degree that STIs, sexually transmitted infections, might spread within a community, if that community has interconnected sexual relationships, monogamy might stop that spread from happening, and therefore confer an advantage to those who pursue monogamy. Finally, there are arguments about optimal group size and how resources are shared. So having multiple partners might feasibly not be realistic insofar as multiple people take more resources to take care of. And so pair bonding, monogamy, may have been the optimal strategy given the costs of having more than one individual. So the argument here is that monogamy may have assisted individuals, both men and women, everyone involved, in resolving several recurrent adaptive challenges. And I'm going to come back to these adaptive challenges when I start to talk about consensual non-monogamy, because if we were to extend this logic and then look at CNM relationships, we might expect that if these individuals are multi-partnering, they are having multiple intimate relationships at once, that they must be experiencing greater pathogen spread. They must be having greater conflict. They must be not mate guarding and not investing in each other or their infants, or they have difficulty managing these many more complex relationships. But if you look at the published research on consensual non-monogamy, this does not seem to be happening, at least in modern instances of consensual non-monogamy. So what's going on in CNM relationships? Really, it's what you would expect in any relationship. They're demographically diverse, so consensual non-monogamy is practiced in most places, though samples that I gather, and samples from many other samples, tend to be predominantly white and Western. Though there are some personality characteristics that predict pursuit of consensual non-monogamy, such as people tend to be more open to experience as a personality trait. They also tend to be more sociosexually unrestricted, meaning that they have greater interest in casual sex in general. They pursue emotional and sexual intimacy. They pursue commitment, passionate love. They have shared goals with their partners. Again, just as anyone in a monogamous relationship would. They have sex for sexual and relational fulfillment. They build families and maintain those families. They also engage in mate retention. That is, they put effort towards maintaining relationships that are valuable to them. And they have and resolve conflict just as much as anyone does. They do not have idyllic relationships where nothing goes wrong, but it's of a comparable frequency and quantity to those in monogamous relationships. But of course, the elephant in the room, the big thing that must be addressed is they do include an additional partner, or more in some cases, and that must introduce some kind of extra amount of complexity. So if we were to take just the consensual out of this, if we're not focusing on relationships like polyamory or open relationships or swinging relationships, where people are communicating with each other about the relationships that they have with other people and everyone agrees to it, and just look at non-monogamy and what that introduces, inevitably, there's something that's very tricky about maintaining one versus more than one intimate relationship. By maintaining one, you still have all the challenges of monogamy. You're still attempting to coordinate with a partner, show them affection, invest in them, have children, care for those offspring, etc. Except now that there's more than two individuals involved, you have some additional challenges. One, you have third parties, you have audiences. I think one of the very common experiences of people in consensually non-monogamous relationships is you can have a third person who can either be a mediator to conflict, that is, they help two people get outside of their own personal dynamic to give a third party perspective. But the other issue, but the challenge that can also introduce is, well, people can start forming alliances. Two partners can gang up on a third. And so you have these, what I would consider moral or group concerns, group coordination concerns. You have to figure out how to manage how resources are shared among individuals within the relationship, and address instances of alliance forming, of people ganging up against another. There's also arguably a greater opportunity for competition of all sorts, such that if you have one individual who is valued by the two other partners, those two partners may compete for that other person's time, attention, finances, etc. And so there's a potential for greater competition. Though, what I would argue, and I'll get to this argument in a bit, there may also be greater opportunity for collaboration. If you have more than two individuals, you can share you can share burdens across a greater number of people, and that can be quite beneficial as well. So this goes both ways. There's also a well-documented literature looking at some of the risks of greater unrestricted sociosexuality, that is sexual behavior, with either casual partners or at least among more than just two individuals. People who score higher, people who are more sociosexually unrestricted, they do tend to report having more self-perceived pathogen risk, that is the likelihood of contracting and spreading an STI. And on average, this is not talking about consensually non-monogamous relationships, but those who in general are non-monogamous do report practicing fewer safe sex practices. However, if you look at CNM relationships and this literature, people in polyamorous, swinging, open relationships are no more likely to contract an STI or spread STIs than people in monogamous relationships. And in fact, what you see is that people who are monogamous, but they are committing infidelity, that is, they are having relationships behind their partner's back secretively, they are in fact the ones who are more likely to be spreading STIs, presumably because they are not using safe sex practices. So non-monogamy introduces that risk, but it does seem like people in CNM relationships are doing something to address it. To put this another way, I like to represent this with a bit of a visual example. Let's imagine that you have a pair bond. You have someone who is a self, someone who is perhaps the hinge, as people in CNM relationships would call it, the person who might be in a relationship with another person as well as another person. So you have the self, and then you have a partner, and each of these might be considered in-pair partners. What these individuals have to do is they have to coordinate their relational motives. Why are they in that pair bond, and what are they getting out of it? And of course, that's going to be related to reproduction and childcare, how they share resources and pursue goals together. And of course, people who are in a relationship often have to coordinate their social status. They have to coordinate their reputation together. Of course, people tend to share reputations when they get into a romantic relationship, which is one of the factors that people often consider when getting into a relationship with someone. So that's something they have to consider. When you add a third person, which in many CNM communities might be referred to as a metamor, I'm also going to use the term an extra pair partners, that is someone who is outside of some pair bond. When you introduce an extra pair partner, this does add an extra level of complexity. Now, instead of maintaining and coordinating these relational motives with one other person, you also have to do the same thing with another individual. You're going to be putting in maybe not an equal amount of effort, but at least some amount of additional effort to fulfill those motives. And what this does is when that's all above board and you now have two individuals with whom you're in a relationship, that can also introduce competition. And competition can take many different forms. Probably the most extreme examples might be something like physical violence. There are certainly documented cases of in-pair and extra-pair partners getting into physical altercations, violently competing with one another. There could be deception, and deception through the withholding of valuable information can be detrimental to all the parties involved. There could be reputational damage, such that being involved with an extra pair partner could cause trouble with one's social status or one's reputation among other individuals within the community. And there's always the threat of mate poaching or mate switching, such that perhaps the extra pair partner gains enough, status within the relationship that they become the new primary or in-pair partner. That's a possibility as well. Of course, we can take this a level even further and say that perhaps the metamor and the in-pair partner have their own relationship, and perhaps they need to fulfill their relational motives as well. And if they have their own relationship, then there could be competition between the extra pair partner and the self. And if there's competition there and there are relationship motives going all around, there could be competition between each of the in-pair partners. So my argument here is you add an additional person, what you're doing is you're adding additional concerns that need to be addressed in some way. Then, of course, we can talk about personality, because these are not just some desexed robots that are getting into relationships with one another. Each individual is going to have a personality, right? So we could talk about how honest and humble an individual is, their sociosexuality, and whether it's matched to someone else's, their attachment style. There's an important personality characteristic within personality psychology known as social dominance orientation, which is your preference for more hierarchical versus relatively more egalitarian relationships among people, how resources tend to be shared. And people could be of different mate value, of different attractivenesses, and that can introduce its own dynamic, as is seen in, again, anyone who's familiar with that literature. Mate value matters quite a bit. And so we have to consider each person's personality, but then also remember that in some cases, you may have formed a fourth relationship here, the one that exists between all three individuals. And that has its own concerns, such as the need to make sure that sexually transmitted infections don't spread, disease management. Sex ratio can matter. So right now I have all three of these individuals as, well, potentially male, but what happens if we change this to 2 women with 1 male? Or 2 females with 1 male? How does that change the relationship dynamic? Or if you have one that is all women, or one where one woman is in a relationship with a man and a relationship with another woman. Sex ratios, we know, matter. Men and women react differently to different types of relationship challenges. They have different relational motives, and so that's going to factor into the complexity of maintaining more than one intimate relationship as well. And of course, like I mentioned before, we need to consider hierarchy, or the types of alliances that could form between partners. This is another concern that I often see within CNM relationships, is that especially for those who are familiar with the term of unicorn hunting, whereby a couple might attempt to get into a relationship with a third individual, and that couple, because they are established, might prioritize their own relationship, their established relationship, over the relationship that they form with this third person. And the third person could be left out or not given as much priority by that couple. And so hierarchy is something that needs to be, I think, overcome and addressed. So I would argue that because there's this greater complexity, there may be, at least by default, some amount of greater level of relationship conflict with, at least in non-monogamous relationships that are not regulated. If you were to just throw people in there and have them form these relationships, how much challenge would there be? I would argue that there is greater challenge. And in fact, people seem to have an intuitive sense of this. A recent study we published in Personality and Individual Differences attempted to quantify this, look at the types of worries that people have about getting into a CNM relationship. We developed a measure of apprehension towards forming a CNM relationship. And we identified 5 reasons that people tend to worry about, or concerns that they have about getting into a consensually non-monogamous relationship. This includes anticipated relationship conflict, that it violated their moral beliefs, that it would cause reputational damage for them, that it would introduce sexual health risk. And for some individuals, they were concerned about same-sex intimacy, because if you are, say, a male mated with an in-pair partner who is female, then and the third partner is another male, you may have concerns about the interactions that you would have with that male. Now, of these 5 reasons, the one that explained the most amount of what's called variance, or the most amount of differences between people and how they responded to the inventory we created for these, anticipated relationship conflict explained the most. That seemed to be the thing driving most of people's concerns. And so this again supports the idea that there may be at least a fear of greater complexity that needs to be addressed in these relationships. For those of you who are interested in this article, I've put the QR code that you can scan. You can also just look at the title. It's open access. It's available. You'll find it online if you look for it. If you want to know how these concerns are related with different aspects of people's moral reasoning and their personality. But then this introduces, I think, a question here is if multi-partnering, if having multiple intimate relationships increases the chance of relationship conflict, how is this prevented? The traditional route would be to say, well, engage in monogamy. If more than one partner is introducing greater complexity and you want to get rid of that complexity and get rid of the conflict that you would normally experience, well, just be monogamous. Don't introduce that complexity into your life. And this would be, I think, the traditional argument for those who defend monogamy, I think, as a relatively superior form of mating. Of course, there's another option where you could clandestinely, so that is, be in a monogamous relationship, but clandestinely engage in extra-pair relationships. And presumably, if your partner never finds out and it never becomes an issue in that way, that could be a way of, say, having your cake and eating it too. That is, being in a relationship, in a monogamous relationship, where your partner is not having sex or forming emotional attachments with other people, but you get to. And the problem with that is we know it doesn't tend to work too well. We know that there's huge literature on infidelity, and we know that those who engage in infidelity tend to have worse relationship outcomes. So what other choice do we have? Well, there might be certain practices that people, especially in consensually non-monogamous relationships, are engaging in, practices that they follow to reduce the conflict caused by having a greater number of intimate partners. And so I would argue that to really get a good sense of what these practices might be, we need to zoom out from consensual non-monogamy and look at multi-partnering more broadly and the different types of multi-partnering that exist. This is a recent encyclopedia entry that I wrote and was published late last year, looking at and trying to define and taxonomize the different types of multi-partnering that exist. So broadly, multi-partnering I define as being in a romantic, sexual, or otherwise intimate relationship with more than one person. But how someone does that can vary drastically. So for some, you might engage in plural marriage, and these types of relationships tend to be, they largely follow scripts that are set in place by either religious institutions or traditional practices that have been passed down from generation to generation, and they have their own guidelines for making these types of relationships work. Sex work, arguably, is a type of multi-partnering. Somewhat more than other individuals, sex workers tend to have a greater number of lifetime sexual partners. And so these individuals have their own strategies for managing that. That is, if you make a relationship transactional, you know where it begins and where it ends with the transactional nature of it. Casual dating and friends with benefits. These are types of multi-partnering. If you are casually dating multiple people and you might be in a relationship with multiple people at once, you may not consider it being in a relationship, but you are having multiple intimate concurrent partners, and people handle those relationships in a certain way. Virtual intimacy, that is sharing intimate photos, having chat room flirtations, sexting, going on to Discord and having kind of relationships with several different people through a virtual medium. That's a type of multi-partnering as well. Infidelity is its own form of multi-partnering, one that is arguably very less stable than other forms, one that introduces a number of challenges to relationship quality, but it's a type of multi-partnering. And then, of course, there's consensual non-monogamy, polyamory, swinging, open relationships. So I would say of these different types of multi-partnering, if we're going to drill down and find which practices are most effective at resolving some of the challenges of having multiple intimate relationships, I think those in consensually non-monogamous relationships have some of the most well-defined practices, and based on the evidence, seem to be the most successful in resolving conflict, with improving satisfaction, etc. So what I've done in my own research is, in approaching how to study consensually non-monogamous relationships, I've asked the question, well, given that monogamy has been argued to resolve certain adaptive challenges, through its practices. Might people in CNM relationships be doing something to likewise resolve those recurrent adaptive challenges that they encounter? People practicing CNM appear to be making it work. There's a good amount of evidence right now that they have comparable relationship quality outcomes to those in monogamous relationships. And so if we look at the types of the adaptive challenges that people will encounter, we can go back to what we originally listed. So the threat of potential abandonment or resource divestment. That is, if a partner is involved with someone else, they might end up leaving the original relationship or invest fewer resources into the original relationship. There's the risk of there being pregnancy, unintended pregnancy, or pathogen transmission. There's the risk of there being what I would call zero-sum partner rivalry. Zero-sum meaning that if two people are competing with one another, one tends to win and the other one tends to lose. So there's no win-win scenario here. So very often there might be some kind of rivalry where one person gains far more than the other, or at least at the cost to another. There's the potential for status loss as well. It's well documented that people in CNM relationships tend to be stigmatized, and there are strategies that they have for resolving that. And moral concerns. Again, these group coordination concerns. How do you share resources within those relationships? Well, to go back to abandonment and resource divestment, very often, or disinvestment, what you often see is that people in CNM relationships communicate extensively. So when there is the threat of a partner spending more time with someone else, or at least spending time in a way that feels to threaten the in-pair relationship, they talk about it. They communicate how that partner spending time with someone else is taking away from relationship quality, and they try to negotiate potentially relationship boundaries or other they attempt to resolve that conflict through that communication. They might do affect regulation or emotion regulation to the degree that you might feel jealous and you fear you are threatened by the potential loss of your partner. Engaging in practices that help you to regulate jealousy or reframe jealousy, not as something negative, but perhaps as something seeing your partner's relationships with other people as more positive could help to address these threats of abandonment or disinvestment. There's also a term known as compersion that people report feeling in CNM relationships. Compersion refers to, rather than fearing or finding or being upset or distressed by your partner's interactions with other people, this is feeling more positive feelings, enjoying the fact that your partner is involved with another. And what we know about compersion so far is that people who experience more compersion do tend to be more satisfied in their relationship. So this may be some kind of protective practice in these relationships. In terms of pregnancy and pathogen transmission, it's well documented that people, especially in polyamorous relationships, polyamorous swingers seem to have the most well-established practices in this regard, based on what we know. They engage in safe sexual practices. They use condoms, other types of protection consistently. They get tested for STIs regularly. And so if you do that, it helps to reduce the probability that disease will spread within a network of people. Partner rivalry. Well, one way to counteract partner rivalry is to attempt to maintain stable and supportive friendships among each of the partners. So rather than let kind of the uncertainty fester and viewing someone else as a potential rival, try to get to know them, understand their motives for being in a relationship with your partner. And you might realize that you actually share a fair amount in common, and you can start to feel compassion for their situation and build up a supportive friendship. One of my favorite studies in this regard is one that was done by Al-Qarnawi back in the late 90s, working with people in plural marriages in a Bedouin Arab society, whereby these individuals, so these were one male, multi-female relationships, marriages, and there were concerns that these relationships were actually harming not only relationship quality, especially for the women, but also for the husband and for the children that they took care of. And what this researcher did was encourage the women to actually band together to form alliances with one another to put greater pressure on the male to help take care of the children. And reportedly, this led to better educational and relationship quality, better educational outcomes for the children and relationship quality outcomes for those in the relationship. In terms of status loss, people in CNM relationships often are secretive about what they do. So if you have the threat of stigma, well, just don't tell people that you're in a consensually non-monogamous relationship. But others have pointed out that this tends to lead to lower relationship quality, and I've observed that in my own data. And so an alternative is make it more acceptable, make social support available to people who are in consensually non-monogamous relationships. Heath Seckinger and several other clinical practitioner colleagues that I have been advocating for there being more inclusive practices in relationship therapy for those in consensually non-monogamous relationships, because therapists who validate, affirm these relationships and do not attempt to get people to be monogamous when they don't want to report better relationship outcomes. And then, of course, to address these moral or group concerns, you could practice some form of hierarchy whereby it's very clear how resources will be shared within the relationship, and that some partners may be considered primary or more important than others, though there are those who argue that hierarchy, in fact, does not help relationships as much as we think it does. And then different practices for managing childcare or taking care of shared offspring, etc. So there's a good amount of evidence showing that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships are doing something to address these traditional, these recurrent adaptive challenges that for most of, I would say, our scientific history, we've been attributing to only being solved by monogamy or something like it. So here's my argument, and one that I'm going to present data to support in the second half of this presentation. My argument is that CNM and other types of multi-partnering practices are each alternative strategies for resolving these adaptive challenges of multi-partnering. That is, CNM and other types do different things for resolving those challenges. And based on what they do, what practices they adopt, that is going to produce different relationship quality outcomes. Those who do a better job of resolving those challenges should report better, more satisfaction, less conflict, perhaps better health outcomes, etc., than those who use arguably less effective practices. So what did I do to assess this? A couple of years ago, I started a grant-funded international project where we wanted to study how do people regulate their and their partner's extra-pair intimacies, these extra-pair interactions within consensually non-monogamous relationships. And specifically, we needed to create a psychometric inventory. We needed to be able to measure how people are engaging and whether people engage in each of these practices. This is a study that included data and collaborators from several different countries, United States, Brazil, and others that you can read here, where our goal was to comprehensively identify and then also measure the strategies that people use to navigate CNM, manage its conflicts, and through that, reduce the harm that could be caused, or at least potentially caused, by the greater complexity of having more than one partner. These are the collaborators that you can see listed here, if hopefully that's not too small for everybody. But what were our hypotheses? So our hypotheses were pre-registered. They were uploaded to the Open Science Framework. You can access them through this QR code here. Broadly, what we predicted is that first, we would document strategies that resolve the recurrent challenges of multi-partnering. We predicted that these strategies would be more common among those who practice CNM versus monogamous relationships versus other types of relationships. We predicted that adherence to each of these practices, these strategies, would be associated with greater relationship quality in specifically multi-partner relationships. And as a side prediction, which I'll get to in a second, we predicted that these strategies would improve relationship quality by reducing infidelity. The logic here is perhaps what people in CNM relationships are doing is they are communicating more, they are talking more, there are fewer surprises, there's less uncertainty about how your partner is interacting with someone else. Versus you commit infidelity, you do so secretly, your partner is now free to invent any scenario that they want, to imagine what that extra pair relationship is like. So if you take out the surprise, if you take out the uncertainty, you take out infidelity, that might itself improve relationship quality. And we tested that as well. How did we do this? In study 1, we just needed to identify what the practices were. So what we did was we recruited 429 individuals through social media and the co-authors' personal networks. And we simply asked people, what do you think are the best and the worst strategies for resolving conflict in a CNM relationship? And we defined CNM for them, of course. What we did was we took these responses, which I'll refer to as ACT nomination data. So that is, we asked the participants to nominate different acts or different practices they thought would resolve conflict. And we combined this with a list of a priori practices. So these were practices that we, as researchers, identified without soliciting from people in these communities. So we combined ultimately our own predictions, our own predicted practices, with the practices that were nominated by these individuals from social online communities. Looking at the demographic characteristics, this was not a college sample. This was seemingly a fairly representative and quite diverse sample. The mean age was about 37. It was about a third female, 2/3 female, a third male, and just a handful of individuals who identified as identified as intersex. In terms of gender, about 50% female, a third male. And then we also had individuals who identified as non-binary, genderqueer, trans, as well as other. Relationship types, about half of them reported being in a polyamorous relationship, or I should say reported being polyamorous, whether they were in that relationship currently or not. 20% in an open relationship, 9.3% swinging relationships, and 5.4% monogamous relationships. We also had 11% who were currently single. And then in terms of world region, 62% were from the US, another fourth were from Europe, and then we also had others from Asia, the Middle East, South and Central America, and Australia as well. What we did to process this data is we first attempted to hybridize, combine the a priori, the practices that we identified, with the nominated practices that were given by the participants. And we sorted these. We took each of these strategies and then we sorted them into different categories. We then had independent sorters, independent raters, people who we recruited onto the project but didn't know about our predictions. They were provided these categories with different definitions, and then they were asked to sort each of the nominations, the data from our participants, into each category. We also had an uncategorized category where if something didn't cleanly fit, they could put it there. Once those were sorted that way, we took those responses, looked at which ones were uncategorized, and tried to revise the categories, recreate the categories. And then we asked these independent sorters to once again resort them. Once they were resorted, again, we revised the structure once more. And after that, we produced what we affectionately termed the multi-partner relationship maintenance scale. And I will refer to that as the MRMS. This is a measure of individual differences in how people adhere to each of the practices that we identified. There were two versions of this that we created, one that people could generally complete about themselves. We called this the MRMS self, and one that they could complete referencing in particular, referencing a particular partner. What this asked was they were given a series of statements and they were asked to please rate how well each statement generally describes you. Scale from 1 to 7 doesn't describe me at all. 7 being describes me extremely well, or does not describe my relationship with this person at all, or describes the relationship extremely well. So what were these items that made up the scale? Here is the point in this presentation where if you're interested in how to maintain a consensually non-monogamous relationship, you're about to learn how. We identified in total 10 different categories of practices. So 10 different practices for how to maintain a consensually non-monogamous relationship. We first identified what we called or labeled the exclusivity agreement. That is, near the beginning of the relationship and throughout the relationship, do you tend to speak with your partners about whether you can have sexual or romantic interactions with other people? So revisiting your agreement about the exclusivity of your relationship often. Attraction disclosure. This is whether you talk to your partner about the attractions that you have to other people. I think the default for most people, and especially those who are traditionally in monogamous relationships, is don't tell your partner that information. If you have a crush on someone, if you form a flirtation at work, hide that. Don't tell your partner about it. That's crazy. Turns out people in C&M relationships often do that. They talk about their attractions to other people with their partner. Compersion, I've already described this. This is the extent to which you enjoy if your partner were having sex or being romantically intimate with someone else. Jealousy regulation looked at how comfortable you feel or how well you communicate with your partner about experiences of jealousy. How openly can you talk about it? How well do you communicate? Partner hierarchy refers to whether you tend to give some individuals priority in your life. So that is, do you give certain romantic or sexual partners more influence over your life decisions, etc., or treat one partner as superior to the other? We also had sexual health maintenance, how often people use safer sex tools such as condoms, hormonal birth control, etc., to guard against unwanted pregnancy or to guard against sexually transmitted infection. Sorry. Oh, no, I did one go on. Shared extra-pair sexuality. This is an interesting one. Whether you involve your partner in your sexual interactions with other people. You very well could just have your partner go off and do their own thing by themselves, and you never share in those experiences. Or you might involve your partner, tell your partner about the fantasies that you have with this other individual, with other people. Childcare willingness. This is how willing would you be to help your partner care for their children? And in our data set, we actually collected whether people had children with their partner and whether they were biological, genetically related children or genetically unrelated children. So presumably, if you're more willing to take care of someone else's children, that would presumably be a good thing, or at least produce better relationship quality outcomes. And then also reputation management. That is, how often do you tend to share share information about your relationships with other people? And then resource distribution is how often you think about how satisfied your partners are with the amount of effort and attention that you give them, or whether you fairly share material or other resources with your partner and each other partner. So do you manage how resources are shared? And think about that. So we identified those practices. We took this inventory, we included it in our second study, and we wanted to answer primarily 3 questions in study 2. First off, is the MRMS valid? And we did this through what's known as exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis. I'm unsure how familiar the audience would be with each of these, but I'll briefly explain them in a bit, as well as using analyses of variance to compare monogamous and consensually non-monogamous people's scores on this measure, on the MRMS. And of course, what we needed to do was see whether the MRMS practices that we identified and adherence to those practices is actually related to relationship quality outcomes. So we performed hierarchical regressions using the MRMS, the scores on the MRMS, to predict satisfaction, relationship satisfaction, which was what we included different measures of satisfaction in survey 1, measures of conflict within the relationship, as well as measures of health and well-being. Now, for the purposes of this talk, which would go massively over time if I covered all the data, I'm only going to report on the survey 1 results here. The other question we wanted to address, and I mentioned this before, is we wanted to know whether the MRMS practices are related to relationship quality through reduction of infidelity. So are people who engage in these MRMS practices, are they reporting less infidelity? And through that lesser infidelity, is that causing, or at least presumably causing, greater relationship quality? And we did this through mediation analysis. How did we recruit? We used snowball sampling via the project members' personal networks. So we asked everyone on the project to go out and distribute this widely. We also made posts to social media frequented by people in CNM relationships. We also, to get a broader audience, kind of a general sample, we used promoted social media advertisement, which if anyone has used that for Facebook or Twitter, what it does is you can have something advertised, for example, to everyone who is 18 years or older within the United States. So it really hits everybody. This is a great method in some senses. In others, in another sense, it was actually very revealing. So when you promote something that is referring to trying to study how people maintain multiple intimate relationships to a very broad audience, you'll end up getting some very interesting responses. And I think that this goes to evidence, at least from an anecdotal perspective, some of the attitudes that people have towards consensual or non-monogamy more broadly. STDs and jealousy, violence. Are you nuts? Get thee behind me, Satan. Some real derogatory stuff. And I think my favorite, call me old school, but you are complicit in and responsible for the downfall of the nuclear family. You got to work harder if you want to keep up with the rest of our institutions. Okay, so I got to work harder. What did we do? Or what did we find? So after recruiting this sample, we had from across all three surveys at the time that I recorded the data for this presentation, we had 1,283 individuals. We had demographic information for a little less than 791 of those individuals. Again, the demographic information looks very similar to what we had in study one, fairly diverse with age, sex, gender. Sexual orientation was quite spread as well. Less than 50% were heterosexual. Little more than a fourth were bisexual, and then we have also pansexual, queer, homosexual, fluid, and several other labels for sexual orientation as well. Most people were poly, 20% were mono, 16% were swinging, 12.9% were open. And again, from different world regions, we had mostly from the United States, or I should say North America, but a good amount from Europe and other areas as well. So what did we find? What we first needed to do was perform what's called exploratory factor analysis. Without getting bogged down in the statistics of this, what this allows us to determine is it takes people's responses to the MRMS and it tries to categorize each of the items together based on how similarly people tend to respond to each of those, to each question. And then once you create these categories, it also attempts to take into account how similar each category is to one another. So this allows us to mathematically create evidence that we have identified the number of strategies that we initially thought would be there. So we thought that there would be 10 strategies. What we had from this exploratory factor analysis is we received evidence that there are at least 8 of them in there. And then when we submitted this data to what's called confirmatory factor analysis, which is a little bit more rigorous, we were able to identify 9 distinct strategies. Now, for those who are familiar with how to read some of the statistical language here, I will say that the first 4 strategies listed here, attraction disclosure, jealousy regulation, childcare willingness, and compersion, these reached acceptable levels of reliability. The other ones did not as much. So what this means is this measure is good. We're finding support for what we predicted, but there are some improvements that we need to make to the measure before it is a very reliable or a robust measure of the practices that we're looking for. But this is what happens when you attempt to measure something for the first time. You get a little bit of noise in there. Those of you who are interested in fit indices and who can read these tables, we did find acceptable fit And this was true when we divided the sample into male versus female, people in monogamous versus multi-partner relationships, people in North America versus Europe, because we did not have a sufficient sample size to look outside of those two world regions, people who were less than 39 years old and people who were older than 40 years old, and for people's evaluations of how they engage in these practices with one partner versus those who had multiple partners, those who engaged them with partner number two. So we found acceptable fit for each of these. And then we also looked at invariance, which looks at the degree to which the MRMS was completed in a similar way across different parts of the sample. So people who across gender, across the different types of relationships, mono versus multi-partnered, where people lived in terms of country, as well as across age. So this is good news for the measure. Although we some of the alpha reliabilities were low for some of the measures, overall we found good fit and we found invariance, which is quite good. So are these practices, so first off, we've found that now the MRMS seems to be a valid measure of these practices. But let's now turn to the survey data from number one, looking at relationship satisfaction. If we just look at survey number one, we had at this time 528 individuals. Again, the demographic breakdown was very similar to the overall sample. And what we did in this survey is we included, we asked about demographic information. We also asked them, how much experience do you have with polyamory, with open relationships, with monogamous relationships? And they answered this on a scale from 1 to 7, either no experience at all or extensive experience. We then also administered the MRMS the self-evaluation. And then about their partners, they also provided demographic information. They completed the MRMS about the partner. They indicated how often they feel that they commit infidelity with, how often their interactions with another person feel like infidelity with this partner, as well as the outcome measures, the actual relationship satisfaction measures that we measured. We're not going to go over the partner measures because, again, it would take too long. How did we measure infidelity? How do you measure infidelity in a consensually non-monogamous relationship? Well, this is how we did it. We asked people, first, what do you consider infidelity or cheating within your relationship? People were in an open, they were given an open response format, so they could just write about what they thought infidelity was. We then asked them, how often do you, on a scale from 1 to 5, have interactions with other people that feel like infidelity? How often do you keep your sexual interactions with other people a secret from your partner? And how often do you keep your emotional attachments with other people a secret from your partner? We can argue about whether this is a good measure of infidelity, but I think it's pretty decent. The outcome measures, how did we measure relationship satisfaction? We used several established measures, what's known as the Perceived Relationship Quality Components Scale, which measures overall relationship satisfaction. Past and planned relationship investments. This measures how invested you are in a partner. We included a measure of sexual satisfaction. Also, eroticism and nurturance scales. So how much is your relationship characterized by kind of sexual elements versus caregiving, nurturant elements? An interdependence measure, that is how interdependent, how much do you rely on each, do partners rely on each other to carry out normal life functions, such as sharing financial resources, providing emotional support, etc. And then also something called the Sexual Communal Strength Scale, which is a measure of how much effort you put towards making sure that your partner is sexually satisfied. All right, what are the results? Let's get to the juicy stuff. So first off, is the MRMS a valid measure of multi-partner relationship maintenance strategies? To assess this, we first collapsed people's responses across poly, swinging, and open relationships and labeled this multi-partner. So whenever I say multi-partner, I'm referring collectively to everyone who is in a poly, swinging, or open relationship. We then compared monogamous and multi-partner people across each of the practices. And the practices that consistently differed between monogamous and multi-partnered were those who were attraction disclosure, that is, talking to your partner about your attractions to other people, how well you regulate jealousy, how often you experience compersion, how often you share in your partner's extrapair sexuality, how often you engage in sexual health maintenance practices, and partner hierarchy. such that people in multi-partner relationships were more likely to do each of these, except for hierarchy. Monogamous people were more likely to engage in hierarchy. Looking at bivariate correlations, just whether one set of numbers varies with a separate set of numbers, we found that people's experience with polyamory, open relationships, and swinging were positively related to attraction disclosure, jealousy regulation, as well as compersion. And there are some other associations in here as well. For example, people in swinging relationships appear to be doing a fair amount of shared extra-pair sexuality. People in polyamorous relationships are not doing as much reputation management, so they seem to be more out about their relationships. But interestingly, and perhaps even more importantly, if you look at the association with these practices with experience with monogamy, there is either no association or there's a negative association. So people in monogamous relationships don't seem to be doing these things, and people in multi-partner relationships are doing these things. Again, suggesting that we have identified these practices that we're attempting to. So I've underlined just several associations that popped up. And I'm going to have a link at the very end to share these slides if you want to take a closer look. Do those who engage in each of these MRMS practices, do they report higher relationship quality? There's a lot of data here, but to summarize it, yes, they seem to. If you look at the very top row, the PRCQ, that's the measure of overall relationship quality. These practices tended to be positively associated with relationship quality, except for hierarchy and reputation. Reputation was actually negatively associated, and sexual health, funnily enough. But it was true for the amount of investment in a partner, how sexually satisfied you were with a partner. There's some nuance in here. Again, I would recommend taking a closer look at this if you're interested. But overall, there was support that these practices were related to higher relationship quality. But we then wanted to know whether these results are specific to people in multi-partner relationships versus monogamous relationships. So are they improving relationship quality for everyone, or are they improving it specifically for people in multi-partner relationships? So what we did was we collapsed these outcome measures into 3 overall categories: general relationship quality, relationship investment, and sexual relationship quality. So we constructed these from each of the measures that we used. In the way you do regression, in step 1, we first tested, is there any association between relationship quality and each of these practices? And yes, we found support for that. This is in some ways replicating what we found in the correlational table, such that relationship quality was higher among those who engaged in more jealousy regulation, more attraction disclosure, more shared extra-pair sexuality, resource distribution, childcare willingness, and investment quality as well. Investment quality seemed to be uniquely related to compersion as well as hierarchy. And sexual relationship quality was related to shared extra-pair sexuality and jealousy only. But to look at whether these differ for monogamous and multi-partnered individuals, in step 2, we looked at the interaction term, for those who are familiar, whereby we saw whether, for example, the effectiveness of attraction, or the relationship between attraction disclosure and relationship satisfaction was moderated by the type of relationship people were in. Overall, what we found is that there was no difference between monogamous and multi-partner people. So regardless of what kind of relationship you were in, if you're engaging in these practices, you are experiencing higher quality relationship outcomes, which I think is a very important detail to take away from this. There was one exception: attraction disclosure. If you were in a multi-partner relationship and you were not disclosing your attractions to your partners, you tended to report lower relationship quality. So there seems to be something protective about disclosing attraction when you have multiple intimate partners. Okay, finally, is the MRMS related to relationship quality by reducing infidelity? What we did was we averaged the scores in the 3 infidelity questions that we had to create a composite, and then we tested a couple of things. First, we wanted to know whether infidelity predicts the 3 relationship outcomes that we identified. And yes, we found that those who engaged in more infidelity tended to report lower relationship quality and lower sexual relationship quality. Though interestingly, not less investment quality. So people who are committing infidelity appear to be just as invested as those who engage in less, but they are reporting less quality and overall quality and sexual relationship quality. Looking at bivariate correlations between infidelity and each of the practices, this was quite big. We found that those who engaged in more infidelity were reporting less of each of the MRMS practices. They were engaging in less attraction disclosure, less jealousy regulation, feeling less compersion, etc. Except for reputation management and partner hierarchy, which were positively associated. So people who are committing more infidelity, they're hiding their relationships more, and they seem to be at least a little bit more hierarchical in how they have their relationships. But then the big question is infidelity mediating the relationship? That is it helping to explain the association between relationship quality and the MRMS practices? And to summarize this slide very quickly, yes, they did. And in fact, for many of the practices. So it seems that infidelity reduction might be one of the mechanisms by which these practices improve relationship quality. Okay. So to summarize all this, is the MRMS a valid measure of these strategies? Yes, though it does need improvement, and we are currently working on that. Do those who engage in these practices report higher relationship quality? Yes. And this is both for monogamous and multi-partner relationships, which suggests that perhaps people in CNM relationships have identified practices that could generalize to monogamous relationships. Even if you are exclusively involved with just your partner, you might still do these things and experience some amount of improvement in your relationship, presumably, if it's causal. And is the MRMS associated with quality through infidelity? Yes, though it was only partially so. So there are other factors that are involved, but infidelity reduction is involved in that. So what do we have to do with this? If you've been paying close attention, you'll realize that all of this is correlational. It's survey data that is not based on, we have not used an experimental design here. And so the next step is to do precisely that. We want to show that engaging in these practices actually causes people to have better relationship quality, that it causes a change in relationship quality. And so I'm designing and currently slowly implementing a longitudinal experimental placebo-controlled study where we teach people educationally about these practices and compare that to a control group where they don't receive that instruction to see whether the instruction improves people's relationship quality over time. And I think that this has a number of implications for relationship therapy, as well as potentially public health interventions. Infidelity, that is people having sex or forming relationships with other people behind their partner's back, can be a public health threat. And so to design a set of strategies that people who have an interest in non-monogamy, that they can follow to improve relationship quality outcomes, I think it have very good public health outcomes and personal relationship outcomes. We also need to do dyadic analyses. So all of this data is from just one perspective, one partner filling out this information. But it would be useful to know how both partners, or in the case of multiple partners, how every partner is engaging in these practices and whether that influences relationship quality outcomes. I'd also like to recruit people in person to get physiological measures, because we know that there's an extensive literature showing that certain physio measures, the biology of people's different aspects of face and body and acoustic perception does affect how people navigate their romantic relationship. So understanding these features would, I think, add a level of granularity to our results as well. And I think the biggest thing to realize is I believe, I have no evidence for this yet, but I believe that the MRMS practices are not just these isolated practices that you should engage in individually. My prediction is that it's a process. Anyone who has opened their relationship or who has done something with consensual non-monogamy, if you were in a relationship and then you became non-monogamous, you realize that it is a process. It's something that unfolds over time. And so I think how these practices are really related to each other is there's kind of a progression, perhaps from at first disclosing your attractions to other people, to your partner, And once that is disclosed, attempting to regulate the jealousy that arises from that disclosure. And when you feel jealousy, attempting to address whether that jealousy is justified or not, whether there's reason to feel jealous, whether there's actually a threat to the relationship. You engage in other practices to perhaps to mitigate that jealousy or to ensure that your partner that you are invested in the relationship. That could lead to compersion, and that might in time lead to the greater relationship quality outcomes that we observe. So I think that this is a process, but again, we'll see what the data shows. So in conclusion, my argument overall is that within the distribution of different alternative mating strategies within humans, some practices are going to reduce harm more effectively than others. And we've identified 9 strategies here, 9 practices by which people might minimize some of the suffering that could be caused by having multiple intimate partners, or at least caused by the complexity of having multiple partners. I think that evolutionary theory has often focused on sexual conflict. That is some of the challenges that can arise because of men's, if we think about sex differences, men's and women's different ideal reproductive strategies or reproductive optima. And I think there could be a greater focus on sexual cooperation. That is, how might men and women coordinate in fulfilling their preferred mating strategies, that is, collaborate to create desirable relationship quality outcomes. And there is an argument that anisogamy, that is the arisal, how different sex differences have arisen, need not produce greater intrasexual competition, as many people have assumed. There may be room for collaboration in pursuing, say, extra pair partners. So I would say that desire for partner variety is a ubiquitous feature of human mating. And rather than uniformly expecting people to engage in what is really arguably abstinence, that is monogamy, why not attempt to identify and share safe practices for forming and maintaining multiple intimate relationships, that is, engage in harm reduction. That is everything that I have. Thank you very much for listening. I realize that was a long talk, but again, my name is Dr. Justin Mogilski. You can find me primarily on ResearchGate. You can look for me on Twitter. I'm also on Facebook. You can find me everywhere. I don't post that often, but sometimes I post things that are worth listening to. I want to thank the University of South Carolina that funded this research, each of my collaborators, and of course, Till Reason Do Us Part for hosting the talk. Thanks, everybody. And if you want to access the slides, you can find them right here.
Thank you so much, Professor. You've given us a lot to think about, especially when it comes to how useful empirical data is for the discussion that we are concerned with here. And it's an aspect of the discussion that we tend to overlook, right? So it's very important to have you here bringing the data to inspire us. I would like to remind everyone that they can leave questions in the chat. I will try to get as many of them in. We have a question by Eduardo that I'm going to share here. So he says, thanks for the talk. A speculative question to begin with. Heinrich places enormous weight on monogamy for the emergence of a weird psychology. Could you counterfactually imagine changes in traits of this psychology if CNM were the prevalent model?
Wow, that's an excellent question. So yes, I've read his work. I agree that that's kind of the interpretation, is monogamy is kind of essential to the emergence of this psychology that at this point we attribute to, I would say, much of the stability of our society, of how people relate to one another, of how we prioritize individuals over groups. I think that, what would the counterfactual look like? I suppose the counterfact, I'm not even sure. So here's how I'm sympathetic to Henrik's argument. It's possible that to get to where we currently are, monogamy has been, if not essential, then something that has facilitated the emergence of most modern industrialized societies as we currently see them. and that has helped to establish, democratized societies, to create peaceful societies. At this point, though, so if I imagine the counterfactual where consensual non-monogamy had been in place of that, I'm not sure if consensual non-monogamy would have led to these same developments. However, now that we are where we are and we have created these stable systems that we have, I think that those systems could be modified to incorporate consensual non-monogamy and permit it. That doesn't directly answer your question, but I think that's how I view it currently. The counterfactual would perhaps be, it might have been a lot messier. I think that it might have been a lot slower because, again, I think that non-monogamy is more complex. You need to account for more. And before you have the systems in place to regulate romantic behavior, or even the systems in place to produce the science that then reveals the practices that are useful for maintaining consensual non-monogamy, it may have been too messy at that time for those institutions, for those systems to arise. So that's the best I can give you. I don't know exactly what the counterfactual would look like if, say, we replaced all instances of monogamy with consensual non-monogamy throughout human history. I'm potentially sympathetic to Henrik's argument there. Does that help? I hope that addresses.
Thank you for that. I would like to ask if you can tell us a little bit more about the practical aspects in researching these strategies, how people deal with the specific challenges of CNM. Were there any challenges in getting funding, for example, or did you how did you come up with an appropriate framework to collect this kind of data? Is it any different from other models in data collecting psychology? And something else that I'm curious about is how reliable self-reporting is when it comes to measuring relationship quality.
So there were some challenges, and I would say the big one is people are fairly secretive about consensual non-monogamy. So they don't want to, it's difficult to get people to talk about it and to trust me as a researcher. I think very often within these communities, consensual non-monogamy has been, in many cases, misrepresented by researchers, and that creates a distrust. And so getting people's trust to take these surveys and to provide that information was definitely a challenge. And the way to overcome that was to recruit collaborators who had built up rapport with these groups, who had a good reputation, who have done research that, I think did justice to these communities and how they were represented. That was the big, I would say, challenge. In terms of the other is that they do make up a substantially lesser proportion of the overall population. Most people are in monogamous relationships. So recruiting them, not only might they be distrusting, might they be secretive, but there are fewer of them. So finding a sizable sample was quite difficult. In terms of the challenges of self-report, I am sympathetic to that, and I agree that there are many limitations to self-report. What we attempted to do in this study was only use those measures that have consistently, in other studies, have consistently been shown to be related. So for example, our measures of relationship satisfaction, these were each pretty well-established measures. For example, the PRCQ has been used quite extensively, and it has predicted other aspects of people's relationship functioning. So what we can say is that, at least given the history of these measures, it seems that these measures are revealing something somewhat consistently and somewhat honestly about how people's relationships work. And so the conclusions that we can draw from that data, I think, are supported. They are bolstered by that history of usage. I will say this, and this is to the credit of anyone who would criticize using those measures. Many relationship measures are and have been designed to be administered to people in monogamous relationships. For example, there was Rusbolt's investment measure one of the challenges there is that looking at investments, one of the measures was, well, are you involved in extra-pair relationships? Do you have relationships with other people, or do you pay attention to other partners? And that was often interpreted as lower investment in the relationship, because who would pay attention to another person and still be invested in their primary partnership? We know that that's possible, but this measure didn't account for it. So but I'll say this, the measures we did use tended to not make assumptions like that. So they should be generalizable across each. Some of the measures, though, in terms of the infidelity measures, we made those up. So there's a world where people lied about how often they commit infidelity. I think one of the advantages of what we did was we first asked people to define infidelity for themselves so that they could just reflect on it. And then the question wasn't whether are you committing infidelity or are you not, but how often does this feel like infidelity, which it seems people are more willing to admit than if you just ask them straight out, how often are you engaging in infidelity? So yes, I would say that there are limitations to that, but given the history of the measures that we used, and I think some of the care that we put into the measures, I'm fairly confident we can at least conclude something about people's relationship quality.
And it's an ongoing process, right?
It is, and any finding that we have, we do need to replicate. We need to show that it happens again, and we need to replicate it using different types of measures, different measures of relationship quality. And that's part of the follow-up as well, yes.
Thank you. There's a question that I like to ask to our speakers every year. So this is our 3rd edition, and I'm going to stick to this tradition and ask you, has feminist and queer scholarship been important to you in any way to get to where you are in the discussions that you've presented today? And if so, what are some of the insights you took from feminist and queer thought that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I think, so if we isolate those two and just look at feminist scholarship, I think that there are a number of, at least within my field of evolutionary psychology, there are a number of very important, I think, feminist scholars who have introduced the idea that traditionally we almost think of, at least in the evolutionary sense, men and women in these traditional gender roles. And very often women were kind of presented as these passive agents that were selecting partners, but not really going out of their way to be the ones who court. And men were the one who always needed to compete. Women were not competing. And I think that perspective, the perspective whereby you realize that both men and women are engaging in many of the same mating behaviors, that yes, there are certainly sex differences, but there are more similarities between men and women and how they approach romantic relationships than there are differences, has been formative for me. For most of my research now, in fact, I try to get away from sex differences and find the common core that both men and women, say, if we're talking about adaptive challenges, what adaptive challenges are both men and women attempting to address or needing to address when they pursue a romantic relationship? So I think that what I attribute to feminist scholarship is, for me, it's been a greater emphasis on similarities, and not just similarities, but then also the greater active role of women in the relationship dynamics that emerge between, that emerge within humans. In terms of queer scholarship, yes. So I would include in that anything that is LGBTQ. So including queer, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans scholarship as well. I think that what that has provided for me is, again, going back to the idea of sex differences, that to the extent that these identities can, in some cases, especially if we're talking about trans and queer individuals, almost a mosaic combination of gendered characteristics, where you don't clearly kind of have, say, a more masculine presentation or a feminine presentation, but rather some mosaic or combined expression of both. Or in some cases, that's considered not even kind of gendered qualities are perhaps lower priority for how people make romantic decisions, how they treat their partners. I think, again, that points to a common core of mating behaviors that everyone has to deal with, regardless of these gendered characteristics, that then also get wrapped up into sexual orientation, because sexual orientation we define in relation to people's gender. So I think taking out that element has helped me to appreciate those qualities. This is actually why part of my research agenda is to look at kind of aggressive, dishonest, predatory behavior, because if you look at sex differences, you're looking at something that, say, men and women have had to deal with individually. But one of the, I think, common cores to everyone is everyone has had to avoid predatory behavior. Everyone has had to overcome aggressive individuals. And so recently I've had much greater interest in generally how people deal with aggressive behavior or coercion or being the target of violence, et cetera. And I think that's, in turn, that's almost, it applies to a much wider kind of gamut of individuals, a wider population of people. So I think that's how I've incorporated a lot of that. It helps me to, I think it helps keep me centered on the common challenges that all people have to overcome in well, in this case, in romantic relationships, but very broadly speaking as well.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for your time today. You've opened a whole new field of discussion for us here. And I'm looking forward to the next stages of your research, the experimental stages. Really curious about that.
Me too. Thank you. I appreciate you guys having me. This is fun.
Thank you. Good evening.
All right. Take care.